Everyone, so here we are with our last few chapters of the Ickabog. So let's get started. Chapter 62, The Bonding. And now several things happened at almost the same time, so nobody watching could possibly keep up. But luckily, I can tell you about all of them. Lord Flapoon's bullet went flying towards the Ickabog's open belly. Both Bert and Roderick, who'd sworn to protect the Ickabog no matter what, flung themselves into the path of the bullet, which hit Bert squarely in the chest, and as he fell to the ground, his wooden sign bearing the message, "The Ickabog is harmless," shattered into splinters. Then a baby Ickabog, which was already taller than a horse, came struggling out of its Icka's belly. Its bonding had been a dreadful one, because it had come into the world full of its parents' fear of the gun, and the first thing it had ever seen was an attempt to kill it, so it sprinted straight at Flapoon, who was trying to reload. The soldiers who might have helped Flapoon were so terrified of the new monster bearing down upon them that they galloped out of its path without even trying to fire. Spittleworth was one of those who rode away fastest, and he was soon lost to sight. The baby Ickabog let out a terrible roar that still haunts the nightmares of those who witnessed the scene, before launching itself at Flapoon. Within seconds, Flapoon lay dead upon the ground. All of this had happened very fast. People were screaming and crying, and Daisy was still holding on to the dying Ickabog, which lay in the road beside Bert. Roderick and Martha were bending over Bert, who, to their amazement, had opened his eyes. I think I'm all right," he whispered, and feeling beneath his shirt, he pulled out his father's huge silver medal. Flapoon's bullet was buried in it. The medal had saved Bert's life. Seeing that Bert was alive, Daisy now buried her hands in the hair on either side of the Ickabog's face again. I didn't see my Ickaboggle," whispered the dying Ickabog, in whose eyes there were again tears like glass apples. "It's beautiful," said Daisy, who was also starting to cry. "Look, here." A second Ickaboggle was wriggling out of the Ickabog's tummy. This one had a friendly face and wore a timid smile, because its bonding had happened as its parent was looking into Daisy's face, and had seen her tears and understood that a human could love an Ickabog as though it was one of their own family. Ignoring the noise and clamour all around it, the second Ickaboggle knelt beside Daisy in the road and stroked the big Ickabog's face. Icka and Ickaboggle looked at each other and smiled, and then the big Ickabog's eyes gently closed, and Daisy knew that it was dead. She buried her face into its shaggy hair and sobbed. "You mustn't be sad," said a familiar booming voice as something stroked her hair. "Don't cry, Daisy. This is the bonding. It is a glorious thing." Blinking, Daisy looked up at the baby, which was speaking with exactly the voice of its Icka. "You know my name." "Well, of course I do," said the Ickaboggle kindly. "I was bonded knowing all about you. And now we must find my Ickabog," which Daisy understood was what Ickabogs called their siblings. Daisy stood up and saw Flapoon lying dead in the road, and the firstborn Ickaboggle surrounded by people holding pitchforks and guns. "Climb up here with me," said Daisy urgently to the second baby, and hand in hand the two of them mounted the wagon. Daisy shouted at the crowd to listen. As she was the girl who'd ridden through the country on the shoulders of the Ickabog, the nearest people guessed that she must know things worth hearing, so they shushed everyone else, and at last Daisy was able to speak. "You mustn't hurt the Ickabogs," were the first words out of her mouth, when at last the crowd was silent. "If you're cruel to them, they'll have babies who are born even crueler." "Bonded cruel," corrected the Ickaboggle beside her. "Bonded cruel, yes, said Daisy. "But if they're bonded in kindness, they will be kind. They eat only mushrooms, and they want to be our friends." The crowd muttered, uncertain, until Daisy explained about Major Beamish's death on the marsh, how he'd been shot by Lord Flapoon, not killed by an Ickabog, and that Spittleworth had used death to invent a story of a murderous monster on the marsh. Then the crowd decided that they wanted to go and talk to King Fred. So the bodies of the dead Ickabog and Lord Flapoon were loaded onto the wagon, and 20 strong men pulled it along. Then the whole procession set off for the palace, with Daisy, Martha, and the kind Ickabog all arm in arm at the front, and 30 citizens with guns surrounding the fierce firstborn Ickaboggle, which otherwise would have killed more humans, because it had been bonded fearing and hating them. But after a quick discussion, Bert and Roderick vanished, and where they went, you'll find out soon. Chapter 63, Lord Spittleworth's Last Plan. When Daisy entered the palace courtyard, at the head of the people's procession, she was amazed to see how little it had altered. Fountains still played and peacocks still strutted, and the only change to the front of the palace was a single broken window up on the second floor. Then the great golden doors were flung open, and the crowd saw two ragged people walking out to meet them, a white-haired man holding an axe and a woman clutching an enormous saucepan. And Daisy, staring at the white-haired man, felt her knees buckle, and the kind Ickabog caught her and held her up. Mr. Dovetail tottered forward, and I don't think he even noticed that an actual live Ickabog was standing beside his long-lost daughter. As the two of them hugged and sobbed, Daisy spotted Mrs. Beamish over her father's shoulder. "Bert's alive," she called out to the pastry chef, who was looking frantically for her son. "But he had something to do. He'll be back soon." More prisoners now came hurrying out of the palace, and there were screams of joy as loved ones found loved ones, and many of the orphanage children found their parents they thought were dead. Then a lot of other things happened, like the 30 strong men who surrounded the fierce Ickabog, dragging it away before it could kill anyone else, and Daisy asking Mr. Dovetail if Martha could come and live with them, and Captain Goodfellow appearing on the balcony with a weeping King Fred, who was still wearing his pyjamas, and the crowd cheering when Captain Goodfellow said he thought it was time to try life without a kin. However, we must now leave this happy scene and track down the man who was to blame for the terrible things that had happened in Cornucopia. Oh, good. King Fred is still alive. He's just crying. Lord Spittleworth was miles away, galloping down a deserted country road, when his horse suddenly went lame. When Spittleworth tried to force it onwards, the poor horse, which had had quite enough of being mistreated, reared and deposited Spittleworth onto the ground. When Spittleworth tried to whip it, the horse kicked him and trotted away into the forest, where I'm pleased to tell you it was later found by a kind farmer who nursed it back to health. Lord Spittleworth was therefore left to jog alone down the country lanes towards his country estate, holding up his chief advisor's robes lest he tripped over them, and looking over his shoulder every few yards for fear that he was being followed. He knew perfectly well that his life in Cornucopia was over, but he still had that mountain of gold hidden in his wine cellar, and intended to load up his carriage with as many ducats as was fit, and then sneak over the border into Pluritania. Night had fallen by the time Spittleworth reached his mansion, and his feet were terribly sore. Hobbling inside, he bellowed for his butler, Scrumble, who so long ago had pretended to be Nobby Button's mother and Professor Freudensham. "Down here, my lord," came a voice from the cellar. "Why haven't you lit the lamp, Scrumble?" bellowed Spittleworth, feeling his way downstairs. "Thought it might not look like anyone was home, sire." "Oh, thought it best not to look like anyone was home, sire," called Scrumble. "Ah," said Spittleworth, wincing as he limped downstairs. "So you've heard, have you?" "Yes, sir," said the echoing voice. "I imagine you'd be wanting to clear out, my lord." "Yes, Scrumble," said Lord Spittleworth, limping towards the distant light of a single candle. "I most certainly do." He pushed open the door to the cellar where he'd been storing his gold all these years. The butler, whom Spittleworth could only make out dimly in the candlelight, was once again wearing the Professor Freudensham's costume, the white wig and the thick glasses that shrank his eyes to almost nothing. "Thought it might be best if we travel in disguise, sir," said Scrumble, holding up Widow Button's black dress and ginger wig. "Good idea," said Spittleworth, hastily pulling off his robes and pulling on the costume. "Do you have a cold, Scrumble? Your voice sounds strange." "It's just the dust down here, sir," said the butler, moving further from the candlelight. "And what will your lordship be wanting to do with Lady Islanda? She's still locked in the library." "Leave her," said Spittleworth, after a moment's consideration, "and serve her right for not marrying me when she had the chance." "Very good, my lord. I've loaded up the carriage and a couple of horses with most of the gold. Perhaps your lordship could help carry this last trunk." "I hope you weren't thinking of leaving without me, Scrumble," said Spittleworth suspiciously, wondering whether, if he'd arrived 10 minutes later, he might have found Scrumble gone. "Oh, no, my lord," Scrumble assured him. "I wouldn't dream of leaving without your lordship. Withers the groom will be driving us, sir. He's already waiting in the courtyard." "Excellent," said Spittleworth, and together they heaved the last trunk of gold upstairs, through the deserted house and out into the courtyard behind, where Spittleworth's carriage stood waiting in the darkness. Even the horses had sacks of gold slung over their backs. More gold had been strapped onto the top of the carriage in cases. As he and Scrumble heaved the last trunk onto the roof, Spittleworth said, "What is that peculiar noise?" "I hear nothing, my lord," said Scrumble. "It's an odd sort of grunting, said Spittleworth. A memory came back to Spittleworth as he stood here in the dark, that of standing in an icy white fog on the marsh all those years before, and the whimpers of the dog struggling against the brambles in which it was tangled. This was a similar noise, as though some creature were trapped and unable to free itself, and it made Lord Spittleworth quite as nervous as it had been last time when, of course, it had been followed by Flapoon firing his blunderbuss and starting both of them onto a path to riches and the country down the road to ruin. Scrumble, I don't like that noise. I don't expect you do, my lord. The moon slid out from behind a cloud, and Lord Spittleworth, turning quickly to his butler, whose voice sounded very different all of a sudden, found himself staring down the barrel of one of his own guns. Scrumble had removed Professor Froylisham's wig and glasses to reveal that he wasn't the butler at all, but Bert Beamish, and for just a moment, seen by the moonlight, the boy looked so like his father that Spittleworth had a crazy notion that Major Beamish had risen from the dead to punish him. Then he looked wildly around at him and saw, through the open door of the carriage, the real Scrumble gagged and tied up on the floor, which was where the odd whimpering was coming from, and Lady Islander was sitting there, smiling and holding a second gun. Opening his mouth to ask Withers, the groom, why he didn't do something, Spittleworth realised that this wasn't Withers, but Roderick Roach. When he'd spotted the two boys galloping up the drive, the real groom had quite rightly sensed trouble, and stealing his favourite of Lord Spittleworth's horses, had ridden off into the night. "How did you get here so fast?" was all Spittleworth could think to say. "We borrowed some horses from a farmer," said Bert. In fact, Bert and Roderick were much better riders than Spittleworth, so their horses hadn't gone lame. They'd managed to overtake him and had arrived in plenty of time to free Lady Islander, find out where the gold was, tie up Scrumble the butler, and force him to tell him the full story of how Spittleworth had fooled the country, including his own impersonation of Professor Froylisham and Widow Buttons. "Boys, let's not be hasty," said Spittleworth faintly. "There's a lot of gold here. I'll share it with you." "It isn't yours to share," said Bert. "You're coming back to Shoeville, and we're going to have a proper trial." "Oh, well, I'm hoping then, because it says we've read every chapter published to date. Not everything's been finished, so perhaps the last chapters haven't been released just yet. So we'll have to wait and see. Tuesday your next chapters will be, so hopefully they're going to continue on, but if not, you'll have a cereal mash put onto purple mash instead. But fingers crossed there's another couple of chapters to finish off the story, because it doesn't seem like everything's ended. I want to know what happens to the fearsome Ickabog and whether they can save it. Head over to Purple Mash for your activity for today, and I'll speak to you all tomorrow.